how to end mental illnesses.
We know that psychedelics deactivate the prefrontal cortex. That's why people say, oh my God, for the first time in my life, there's no rumination, right?
I don't care what people think. For the first time in my life.
For the first time in my life, there's no like mean voice in my head, or I don't care if I didn't respond to this email or whatever, right? And then a lot of people say that they're not feeling fear. They're feeling more of this expansiveness, abundance, safety, love, connection.
What does it take for your drug to get the FDA approval?
It takes about $500 million to bring a drug to market. So if our drug is successful, by the end of the approval process, we will probably have spent $400 to $500 million developing it. It takes about 10 years to do that.
Welcome everyone, another episode of Envictorial Podcast coming to you from Venice, California. Today our guest is Dina Burkitbayeva. She's a founder and CEO of Freedom Biosciences, as well as a co-founder and former general partner at PsyMed Ventures. Dina, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Arman.
So the goal today, my intention at least, is to record a conversational video lecture on psychedelic therapy. Are you along for the ride?
Yeah, I'm up for it.
So let's start with a banger. How to end mental illnesses? What's your vision?
I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't think we will end them. But I think what we can do, and we're on the right track to, is to create very effective treatments to help those that are struggling with them. The reason why I say we can't end them is because, they're just part of life. Even people who are perfectly healthy now could have an episode because life happens, some sort of life event. So when people do have a depressive episode, anxiety episode, PTSD, or another ailment, there are some really incredible treatments that are on the market today. But not all people respond to those treatments. So just to give you some statistics, there's 300 million people worldwide that are diagnosed with major depressive disorder. It's a very debilitating disease. It results in about 10 years reduction in life expectancy because there's so many comorbidities with depression. And about a third of those 300 million people, which is about 100 million people, are treatment resistant, meaning they don't respond to the existing antidepressants. And this is really where my personal interest and now my professional interest has been lying, is how do we create effective treatments for this 100 million people that currently cannot find treatments that would work for them. And this has been the work of the fund, PsyMed Ventures, that I had co-founded and ran, and now my company, Freedom Biosciences.
Mm-hmm. If we were to discuss the history of psychedelic therapy, when did it start?
We have no idea. It could have started with the very, very first humans that ever existed, because psychedelics or hallucinogens, right, are naturally occurring. And we have evidence from millennia and thousands of years ago that various indigenous tribes in Africa, in Latin America, in Central Asia, where you and I are from, that these psychedelics have been used for various purposes, right? Including treating physical ailments. Sometimes, people were sick and shamans or other healers would use these to treat people's physical diseases. And but mostly there's a lot of evidence around using more of the spiritual, psychological, mental ailments. So we have evidence that's going back millennia. I think maybe kind of what's more relevant to our conversation, because my work has been around the therapeutic use of psychedelics, right? So how can we take the existing evidence, whether it's from the indigenous communities have used it for many years, or from the last, let's say 60, 70 years of sort of more modern medicine use of it, and now develop effective treatments that can be used in a medical setting for people who are struggling with mental illnesses, right? And that history starts in the 1930s, when Albert Hofmann, who was a scientist at Sandoz, which is a large pharma company in Switzerland, first synthesized LSD. And that happened by chance. He was synthesizing it in his lab in Switzerland for a totally different use. And then he got some of it on his hands. And then when he was riding home from his lab in 1938, he experienced hallucinogenic effects. He basically had a trip.
While biking.
And that's kind of the famous, where the famous bicycle day comes. It's April 19th. The psychedelic space celebrates that day. And that's the day when Albert Hofmann had a trip while bicycling back home. And that's when he found out that there was a real kind of hallucinogenic effect to it. They didn't yet know that there was any therapeutic effect in trying to treat mental health treatments. But what happened after that is various academics, scientists, therapists in the US and across the world, but kind of most notably scientists and therapists from Harvard University started requesting LSD from Sandoz so that it can be shipped to them and they can use it for various experimentations. And kind of Harvard University, which is my alma mater, has become a center of using psychedelics as therapy, primarily to see if there's a way to help people treat their mental health illnesses or for more kind of spiritual, personal development purposes as well. So 60s and 70s became, Harvard became a hotspot for this. There were some negative events that went down with a gentleman called Timothy Leary, who was a professor and a researcher at Harvard, which eventually led to criminalization of all psychedelics. There was a lot of kind of political motivations behind this, because this was right around the time of the Vietnam War with the US, and the hippie movement, the Summer of Love movement was gaining traction. And a lot of that was fueled by the use of psychedelics among the young people who were going against the government and saying, we don't want to participate in war and we don't want to go to war. So it became a real threat to the government that the psychedelics became a threat to the government. That maybe, their agenda of going to war was compromised. And so psychedelics basically became criminalized. All research was halted from, the 70s, early 80s to basically about 6-7 years ago, when sort of this renaissance of psychedelic therapeutics has emerged, and we can kind of later talk about why that's happened. And that's really the time when I came into the space and have been involved ever since.
What are the main applications of psychedelic therapy? What is it used for?
There's some applications that are more developed than others, and those are for the treatment of depression, PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and more of kind of the mental health treatments. There's also some preliminary research around things that are like anorexia, bulimia, as well as neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And obviously, more of the kind of spiritual exploration and personal development. There's other types of research that are ongoing right now, but they're in much earlier stages.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the different methods of the therapy, what are some of the methods which come to mind?
Sure. So I think for methods of therapy, probably the best classification here is to talk about the different types of psychedelics.
Uh-huh.
Right. These are different molecules that have different experiences and effects. Let's start sort of chronologically based on what we believe will go into the market, or what will gain FDA approval, at least in the US. So the first one, which was approved in 1970 and then has been used for the treatment of mental health, is ketamine. Mm-hmm. It was actually my co-founder, Dr. John Krystal, who's the chair of psychiatry at Yale, who first ran the study and showed that ketamine was an antidepressant in the late 90s at Yale. And ever since then, that kind of, kicked off this huge industry of using ketamine as an antidepressant. And there's, over 600 clinics in the US that are administering ketamine and over 1,000 that are working with esketamine. So that's the first
So it's legal
molecule.
to use it.
Yes, it's
It's
federally
approved.
legal. It can be prescribed to a patient and can be,
How do
administered.
patients use it? Like, do they take it under doctor supervision? What's the typical session is like?
Yeah. So there's a variety of things, but for patients who are treatment resistant and need large doses of ketamine for it to be effective, a usual session is going into a clinic and spending about 2 hours there. You go into a clinic, your vitals are taken, you sit down, and you have a 45-minute ketamine infusion or an IM shot.
Do you have to shut your eyes, or what's the...
Yeah. Usually, every clinic it's different, but usually they kind of put you in a comfortable chair. You're hooked up to the IV. They're monitoring your vitals. Your eyes are usually closed. It's a dimly light room. Maybe there's pleasant music playing, and there's a nurse or a doctor that are making sure that everything's going okay. So that experience of having the trip, the dissociative, slightly hallucinogenic trip, is about 45 minutes. But then you're staying in the clinic for another 45 to an hour to make sure that the effects are fully gone so you can safely leave the clinic.
What are some of the prerequisites for a patient to be eligible for this kind of session? Are there any precautions or warnings?
Sure. So I'm not a clinician. I cannot give any kind of healthcare advice, just putting it out there. But based on sort of what I know generally, patients, the counterindications for patients is they cannot have any psychotic or schizophrenia tendencies. I think any kind of psychoactive drug would be counterindicated for patients that have these potential tendencies. But generally, ketamine is pretty safe. It's the most used anesthetic in the world, according to the World Health Organization. Most people who ever had surgery, even dental surgery, most likely had ketamine in that anesthetic cocktail. And it usually works pretty well with other drugs and other antidepressants. That's why it's been such a successful antidepressant. The other thing about ketamine is that it works almost immediately. So let's say you are a deeply depressed patient. You've been trying different antidepressants, oral antidepressants. There's 50, 60 of those drugs on the market, but they're not working for you. And even if they did work for you, if you're having a very deep and strong depression episode, or God forbid you're suicidal, it would take you 2 to 6 weeks to get a response with oral antidepressants. I don't think anyone wants to wait or can wait that long. So this is where ketamine comes in, and why it's just been such a breakthrough in the world of psychiatry. Because it works almost instantaneously, and for most patients within 24 hours.
In a single session sufficient, or?
Most times not. So it is kind of a protocol regimen. It differs for every patient, but usually patients come in more often up front. So sometimes as often as twice a week. And then it gets spaced out in the following month, and then eventually they're maybe not coming in at all, or they're coming in once every 6 months or a year as maintenance.
Mm-hmm. So you were saying, so ketamine is one of the compounds, or whatever you call it. Maybe you can name some others.
Sure. So ketamine was the first one. Esketamine, which is an S isomer of ketamine, was approved for treatment-resistant depression and depression with imminent suicidality in 2019. So that is the first psychedelic-like drug that was developed by a large pharma, Johnson & Johnson, by market cap. It's the third largest pharma today, and was approved by the FDA for mental health. So that was a huge win for our industry. And it actually just last quarter hit $1 billion in sales, meaning it's a blockbuster. It's a huge kind of commercial success. That was approved in 2019. Now there is dozens and dozens of other psychedelics that are being developed and going through the FDA approval process. The one we're expecting to get approved next is MDMA. MDMA, by some people, might be known as ecstasy. It usually ecstasy in a recreational setting has some MDMA, but also is mixed with other methamphetamine-like drugs, like speed. That's what makes people want to sort of dance and kind of gives them the activity. MDMA on its own, based on the anecdotal evidence, is more of a kind of a calming and a heart-opening drug that makes people feel very safe. And that's why it is absolutely the most effective drug for PTSD. There's no drug that's approved for PTSD today. It's one of the most treatment-resistant drugs out there in the U.S. and all over the world. But in the U.S., there's a lot of attention towards it because a lot of the veterans who are fighting in war are coming back to the U.S. are really debilitated. And the government really wants to help them find relief to these symptoms. And so MDMA has shown the type of results that psychiatry has never seen before. We don't want to call it a miracle drug, but it's as close as it gets to a miracle drug based on the clinical evidence that we've seen from clinical trials across psychiatry, across all time.
And the frequency of use of the MDMA, which is the suggested frequency, is similar to that of ketamine? Or?
No, so the protocols would be very different. There are different treatments in the sense that ketamine is a much shorter treatment, 45 minutes, but you have it more often in the beginning. And then MDMA is a much more involved, longer treatment. So that's about a 6 to 8 hour treatment, full day. And usually we presume that it's going to require 2 therapists in the room because that's how the clinical trials have been run. So if a patient were to come in, they would need to be in a single room that's noise isolated. They would be lying down, music, blindfold, and there would be 2 therapists of 2 different sexes. So, for example, a male and a female therapist who would be there to help support the experience. With ketamine, while you can have a therapist, it's not required, and most people kind of maybe go back and speak to their usual therapist later. So MDMA will, probably will only require, or based on what the clinical trials have been, is 3 sessions. With ketamine, it's more sessions than that.
Anything else? TMT, I guess, is another one?
So MDMA might be approved within a year. The next after that, kind of in terms of how far along it is in the FDA approval process, is Psilocybin. That's a psychoactive ingredient in magic mushrooms. And that is a similar regimen to MDMA. It's also a longer treatment. Will mostly require 1 or 2 therapists in the room, and that is probably going to be approved in the next 3 years. Then there's other drugs, like you mentioned. There's DMT, 5-MeO DMT. There's ibogaine or iboga. There's mescaline. And honestly, hundreds of other potential, both naturally occurring as well as newly synthesized psychedelics.
You mentioned there was a winter in psychedelic therapy starting from 70s. What changed 7-8 years before? 7-8 years ago?
Yeah, I think it was a couple of things. I think the first thing is it became obvious the motivations why it was originally criminalized in the 70s. And, people understood that there were other motivations rather than these drugs being actually harmful to one's health, because there was a lot of that type of propaganda. I think the other thing was the fact that we started receiving very positive clinical data, right? It was right around the time when MDMA showed later stage clinical data. And like I said, we don't want to call it a miracle drug, but it probably is as close as it is to that. There's also other types of, there's other reasons, right? And one that I believe kind of is tangential, but is very important. And that's why there's interest in psychedelics from large pharma. and big biotech funds that are a lot more traditional. And the reason for that is there hasn't really been any major innovation except for ketamine in the last 35 years. The most widely used antidepressants, SSRIs, which work on the serotonin receptors, was developed and approved in the 80s and 90s, right? So we haven't really had any real innovation for 35 years. If we think about innovations across other parts of healthcare, like oncology, there's a new innovation every 6 months. Psychiatry, big problem, very little innovation. So that has led to the fact that patents started expiring. And as we know, the way you make large sales is when your drug is patented, right? So you don't have generic manufacturers coming in and undercutting you in price. And so what started happening about 8 years ago is that the patents started coming up and generics coming in, and then the large pharma companies losing revenue on their psych programs. And that's when they started kind of thinking again as to how can we develop new drugs that will be patented. And psychedelics or 5-HT2A agonists or ketamine and NMDA receptor agonists or MDMA, which works on the serotonin level, right, have different mechanism of action, basically how they work on the brain. But these are some of the more innovative antidepressants that also have shown the most compelling clinical data. And so kind of all of these factors mixed together is something that got both investors interested in psychedelics as well as big pharma.
What countries are most liberal when it comes to psychedelic therapy regulation?
That's interesting. I mean, it depends on how we look at it. I mean, the US, I think, has been very supportive of this. We've seen the FDA support these programs. 2 programs, MDMA for PTSD and Psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, received breakthrough designation from the FDA, which basically says, hey guys, we really like this. We want to help you. We'll help you get through this faster. Over 100 cities in the US are now having some sort of a decriminalization effort. Just recently, I think it was last week, there was yet another big step forward for California to decriminalize psychedelics. Canada has also been kind of moving forward quite fast. Australia has set up a large funding vehicle to support psychedelics. But then there's kind of the more known ones, right? The Netherlands. In the Netherlands, it's legal to be using mushroom spores, right? And there are legal psilocybin retreats that one can go to. Obviously, places like Mexico, Costa Rica, Peru, Brazil, in variety of ways, either mushrooms, or mescaline or ayahuasca are decriminalized or fully legal.
And let's talk about PsyMed Ventures. One thing I found on your website is maybe like around 10 different areas of 10 different areas where you invest. And I'm a dilettante. Well, not even a dilettante. I know very little about this space, as you probably observed from me botching the DMT abbreviation. When it comes to the different types of investments, so you have psychedelic medicine and new compounds, right? So that's we discussed that a little bit. So I assume it's about creation of new drugs in the space and getting it clinically approved. Talk about neurotech and human augmentation.
I mean, I think what we believe at PsyMed Ventures is that mental health is not just about helping people get from, a negative space to the baseline, but it's also helping them kind of soar above that and achieve more human wellness. And so we look at the spectrum of companies and teams that are working on this. You and I have discussed in depth about psychedelic therapeutics, and we're focused on the medical approach to it. So it's like what can be approved by the FDA that can be then covered by insurance, because we want the largest possible access to this. It's nice to have retreats or ceremonial use of psychedelics, but that tends to be only accessible to the very few people who have access because they know someone or because they have a lot of money to pay for it, right? And we want this to be accessible to a lot of people. When I was looking at kind of making a personal decision as to what I was going to do professionally, and when I decided on mental health, I looked at things like what are some of the modalities that are the closest to approval process, so closest to being in patients, and have the most compelling clinical data. Those were the two criteria that I was looking at. And psychedelics came as number one, right? Because they've been used by millennia. There's a lot of clinical research from universities such as Johns Hopkins, Yale, Harvard, Imperial College London, Stanford, UCSF. I mean, the biggest names, right, have done research on psychedelics and have come up with positive and strong results. The second to that was neurotechnology. And within that, it's neuromodulation, right? And that's a fancy word for modulating or stimulating different parts of the brain.
How does it work? Like, do you connect to some device or?
Yeah, so these are usually medical devices. You would put a medical device on and you would stimulate or destimulate a certain part of the brain. So we don't know that much about the brain. It's kind of one of those organs in the human body that we know the least about. It's still kind of a black box. We give people medicine and then we ask them, how do you feel, right? Not very high tech, but that's what we have right now. But neurotech is something that's continuously helping us get better understanding. So let's say for myself, for example, right? When I do scanning of my brain, when I am in a more anxious state, my prefrontal cortex is very activated, sort of in this part of the brain. That's where rumination lives, right? Like that's where you're kind of in these mental loops. You keep thinking about, oh, I didn't write this email. Why did I say this? Like, where's my life going? That's the thought, right? And then there's the amygdala, which is kind of more centrally located in the brain. And that's the fear center.
The reptilian brain, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's also like if you're in a state of fear, your amygdala is going to be very activated. So we know that psychedelics deactivate the prefrontal cortex. That's why people say, oh my God, for the first time in my life, there's no rumination, right?
I don't care what people think. For the first time in my life.
For the first time in my life, there's no like mean voice in my head, or I don't care if I didn't respond to this email or whatever, right? They're able to be present. And then a lot of people say that they're not feeling fear. They're feeling more of this expansiveness, abundance, safety, love, connection, oneness, whatever. And that is most likely, these are all hypotheses, but they seem very plausible, is that the amygdala is deactivated. And so psychedelics and other drugs do that to different extents. And then neurotechnology is trying to do similar things by stimulation, right? And then sort of the trick here is how far into the brain cavity can the stimulation go safely, right? Because it's hard to get through the skull safely and then without kind of disturbing other parts of the brain. So there are different teams that are working on how do we do this safely, how to do this most targetedly, right? And there's some sci-fi type stuff that exists already. I can't name any names because these teams aren't stealth mode. They're just not ready to talk about this. There's more trials that need to be done, but it's now possible to have a device that you can control with your phone and say, I want to feel, I don't want any rumination.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that can happen within 45 seconds.
And a device like that already exists.
Yep.
It's just not on the market.
It's just not on the market because it takes so long to go through safety, efficacy. It's all of these teams want to make sure that what they bring to the market is safe. You can tell the device that you want to feel a little buzzed, like you had 2 glasses of wine. But then when you press on the button, you say, I don't want to feel this way anymore because I want to drive in 10 minutes. It deactivates, and in about 2 minutes, you feel back to normal.
So you can be part of a company without drinking.
You can, yeah, I guess, these are all still early. We're not making any like clinical claims here. But, there's some really interesting stuff that exists here. And I think in the next 3 to 5 years, some of these products are at least going to be announced. We don't, they're probably not going to be on the market until 7 to 10 years from now. But there's a lot of innovation that's happening in neuro right now.
Are there any alternatives to human augmentation when it comes to maybe there are some exercises or maybe some diet or yoga techniques which are effective in neutralizing your prefrontal cortex or amygdala?
Absolutely. You just have to be willing to do it.
Can you give some examples? What kind of exercise do you suggest for us when we are feeling anxious or we are fearful?
Yeah, I think breathing. Breathing probably is the most effective exercise that you can do. You just breathe deeply. There's a thing called box breathing. You count 4, 6, 8 counts in, you pause for the same amount of counts, and then you exhale for the same amount of counts.
Using both nostrils, so just one of them, or?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter, okay.
It doesn't matter. I think when you're breathing deeply, you're kind of telling your nervous system that you are in a relaxed state. A lot of times our nervous system doesn't know what's happening, right? Sometimes, does this happen to anyone? You're like in a perfectly safe place and all of a sudden you feel really anxious because your head made something up, right? They're like, I'm not safe. I'm going to get in trouble for something, right? That is your head giving a signal to your nervous system that you're not safe, but you're perfectly safe. So while we can negatively affect our nervous system, we can also positively affect our nervous system by tricking it into thinking that you're safe. Mm-hmm. Breathing is the easiest thing to do. Going outside and walking. Animals. People who have a dog or a cat or a horse, whatever animal.
Playing with animals.
Playing with animals is just touching an animal is very effective. Some things that are like kind of, not that as immediate is cut out alcohol. I think a lot of people use alcohol to calm their anxiety, but once it ends up happening, it's a depressant and it increases anxiety. So like at the end of the day, people are like, I really need a drink. They have a couple of drinks, but like at 5 or 6 in the morning the next day, their anxiety is even higher. And so it's like a lot of people are in this vicious loop. So I think cutting out alcohol is probably one of the hardest things for a lot of people, especially from our part of the world, because it's such a big part of life and culture. Exercise. Whenever people feel anxious, the first thing that I ask them was like, have you exercised today? And they say no. And I was like, okay, then like go fix that. And I do the same with me. Right. There are some things that don't cost a lot of money. They take time and dedication, which is a lot. That's expensive in its own way. But I would say like fix those things. And if you still need help, then look for more of the medical intervention, which quite a few people need because life's hard.
Wonderful. Thank you. Precision psychiatry. What is it?
So precision psychiatry is basically trying to find better ways to develop drugs and diagnose mental health conditions and then prescribe better drugs. So the way it works in the US and I think in the rest of the world, if someone is having a depressive or an anxious episode and they go to a psychiatrist or a general practitioner and they say, I'm not feeling well. Like I think I'm depressed. And if the doctor decides to prescribe them something, the doctor, they do have experience and there's some kind of protocols around what kind of drugs to prescribe. But imagine you have 50, 60 drugs that you're working with, and you're kind of guessing a little bit as to what to prescribe to that patient. And it's a big toll on the patient. It takes 2 to 6 weeks to start responding. It changes your brain chemistry. Some people experience like personality changes, right? And then there's side effects, including changes in appetite, changes in energy level, sexual dysfunction, and just like personality changes. And so what we're trying to do in the world of precision psychiatry is to use big data, including different biomarkers such as brain scans, to try to understand if a patient has certain biomarkers, like let's say overly activated amygdala or, overly active prefrontal cortex. How can we use the data to be more predictive and more accurate with what it is that they're dealing with, what is the cause of their depression, and what are the most effective drugs? To take out the whole guessing game and then the trial and error that comes with prescribing different antidepressants and then going back for it, etc. So that's kind of like on the treating of patient side. How can that be useful for venture funds such as ourselves, in terms of maximizing kind of returns from a company that we're investing in? And that's really around being able to help biotech companies to choose the best indication. So like what it is that we're developing this drug for, because drugs can be like, sometimes biotech companies are sitting there and be like, well, this could be developed for depression. It could also be helpful with anxiety. It could be helpful with PTSD, right? And, there's only so much analysis that you can do there. But if you've used data, there could be potentially better predictive indications. What indication and also what demographic this could be used for, right? So could it be patients that are of a certain age, of a certain sex, or of certain comorbidities that we have? And so this has the potential to speed up the process to get a lot more effective drugs through to approval, but also save a ton of money. It takes about $500 million to bring a drug to market. So if our drug is successful, by the end of the approval process, we will probably have spent $400 to $500 million developing it. It takes about 10 years to do that. Imagine you spend $200 million and then you're like, this doesn't work. It sucks, right? And so if we can use some of the big data, machine learning, AI capabilities to be able to earlier in the process predict what would work and what wouldn't, that would be awesome.
On that note, how does investing in your space make the work of a venture firm different than a firm investing in consumer social or B2B SaaS? In what ways do you have to think different, and what are the similarities with maybe like funds investing in internet?
I guess besides the obvious things that we care about different things, I think in terms of portfolio construction, right? Because ultimately as a venture capital investor, you want to make sure that you bring returns back to your investors. And there are a few things to consider here. We have a different risk profile, right? And we also have a different window of investing, right? Mm-hmm. Through PsyMed, we invest in drug development, which are the biotech companies, Neurotech, which is primarily medical devices, precision psychiatry, which is kind of data mixed with drug development, but we also invest in platforms. So all of those have different kind of risk profiles and timelines, etc. But why don't we talk about drug development? Because I think that's what we've been focusing on the most. So it's, as with any startup, it is extremely risky, right? You have a new molecule that you most of the time only have animal data on. There's only mice data. In mice, in some ways very similar to humans, sometimes very different. So there's a lot of extrapolation that you have to do. And ultimately, you just have to see whether it's going to work in a human. It takes about 3 to 5 years to get data on a human. And, because of the high kind of fail rate with biotech, especially in this period, you want to be diversifying, right, into different molecules. So the way investors do it, they invest in more companies, but they also can invest in platforms. And this is something that's become more widespread when one company has multiple drugs, multiple programs, but they're also platform companies, and that's what Freedom Biosciences is. We have a whole pipeline of other drugs that we are developing, that we're putting into animals and starting to put into humans, right? Because if your main drug doesn't work, you continuously want to have a pipeline of new programs that are replacing that. We also, as investors, do not always plan, and we actually don't plan to stay invested in the company through to when the drug gets approved, because that's too long. 10, 12 years, that's too long. So what happens is, because we're early stage investors, we usually come in at the pre-seed or seed. All you have is animal data. But about 5 to 6 years in, you get human data. And if that's positive, that's can be a time when a company either goes public, because biotech companies just need so much funding. Once you start going into humans, you need hundreds of millions to run the trials, or the company gets sold to a larger pharma company. So there's usually, if successful, the sort of 5 to 6 years in, there's an exit point for the early venture investors.
Either as through an IPO or selling secondaries?
An acquisition, yeah.
Or acquisition, got it.
Yeah.
And the acquisition, is it typically made by a bigger pharma company who can take it to the masses, or?
Yes, so that's kind of the most likely situation, is that a large pharma comes in if there's positive data, and they either take it through the final stage of clinical trials with humans, or they buy the asset later at, like, let's say at phase 2 or 3, and then they do commercialization. Commercialization is really expensive, it's really challenging, and it's usually only the pharma companies that have that infrastructure. So they have the relationships with physicians to educate them. They have the relationship with clinics, with insurance companies. Not many biotechs want to kind of take that on.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to, so you mentioned that you are with PsyMed Ventures and is early stage pre-seed to seed fund. What's your average check, and how many investments do you make per year?
We focus pre-seed, seed, and Series A. Our check sizes vary from about 500,000 to $1.5 million. Mm-hmm. And then there's some capital also preserved for follow-ons in the companies that we've already invested in. And we make about 6 to 8 investments a year.
Got it. And what's if you were, let's say we have some aspiring investors in the space, what are some of your suggestions? Let's say they want to invest in pre-seed to seed, Series A as well. What's the best way to build a portfolio? I mean, how big? What's the recommended fund size? How many shots at goal should the fund have to be successful in this space?
That's a challenging question. You have to model it, learn how to model, get really good scientists and clinicians on board. I think it's too often that you see business people trying to figure it out themselves. And I think this is such a complicated and quite a new space. Like, obviously psychiatry isn't, but I think we're constantly learning new things about the brain, that you need people who are at the cutting edge. So a lot of the people at the top kind of academic institutions are at the top front, some pharma companies. You really need that scientific and clinical support. to be able to due diligence these companies. And then, I've seen successful funds who said, I'm going to really double down and only invest in 10 companies. And what I need is one of them to hit to, maybe do a 2 or 3x on my fund. Other people have successfully had a very different approach where they've invested in 20, 25 companies, at which point they need 2 to 3 to hit. But I think a lot of it is luck, as we know, but also, yeah.
What are some of the biggest exits in your space? Like if you were to look at the industry as a whole,
in psychiatry as a whole,
we can discuss psychiatry, or like let's say, like whether it's psychedelic therapy, psychiatry, and maybe we can just zoom out and discuss biotech, life sciences in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think in psychedelics, it's a new space. We're probably kind of 5 years in or so. We've had a few successfully kind of large IPOs, somewhere in the $2 billion. That was Atai Life Sciences, Compass Pathways, is investments that I made early on. And we've also recently had a few acquisitions by large pharmas that have been more modest, so sort of in the 60 to 80 million. Otsuka which is a really large Japanese pharma, acquired a company called Mindset that's developing an analog of psilocybin, a shorter acting psilocybin drug. In terms of what's happening in pharma, I think it's something that's closest to us because a lot of my team at Freedom Bio comes from Biohaven. And Biohaven is the CNS drug as well. So it's in the world of CNS, and it's a New Haven, Yale affiliated company.
And CNS stands for?
Central nervous system. Sorry.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, central nervous system. So it has to do with the spine and the head. And they just got sold to Pfizer last year for almost $12 billion.
Mm-hmm.
So my co-founder, John Krystal, was one of the founding members. Our chief medical advisor, Rob Berman, was a co-founder and the original chief medical officer. And a lot of the Biohaven team came over to Freedom as well.
Mm-hmm. So what does the company do again?
Biohaven?
Yeah.
So they're developing new drugs in the neurodegenerative space.
Got it. And if you were to look at the biotech space in general, what are some of the biggest companies and exits in the space? Again, like explaining to a dilettante. I don't follow the space at all.
I think in biotech just generally, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the failure rate is as high as in tech, right? If you're taking from conception to success. If it is successful, it's usually a shorter exit.
Mm-hmm. So you get to an exit faster.
It's usually within 10 years, right? Because if you have a drug, there's kind of a timeline at which you're getting first set of human data, second set of human data, etc.
What's the typical timeline? Let's say you mentioned that you did, let's say it's working on mice. In 5 years, you're testing it with humans. Then maybe in a year or two, you're testing it like with humans again. And then when is it FDA approved in the best case scenario? Starting from the first test on humans.
So that's about 7 to 8 years.
From that moment.
That moment, is when you could get approval.
But those companies, they IPO even before getting FDA approved or not?
Yes.
They do.
So usually companies IPO after having phase 1 data.
Okay.
Rarely, but it happens before having any kind of human data. Phase 1 is original human data. So usually they go IPO after phase 1 or phase 2. Mm-hmm. Acquisitions also happen as sort of phase 1 and phase 2, sometimes after phase 3. The reason why they go public so early, and then where they get acquired, it's because then you need 100, 200, 300 million. And at that point, it just becomes not feasible to raise private money.
You mean it takes 200 to 300 to get FDA approval?
It could take up to $500 million for the entire process.
Super expensive.
But I think like phase 2s and 3s is what gets in the hundreds of millions in terms of costs. And that's when you most likely you need to raise money from the capital markets.
When you get FDA approved, then you have to produce it at scale. That's another 100 billion or something. Oh, that's another 100, let's say a few hundred million.
Yeah, commercialization tends to be a few hundred million as well because, at that point, there's a lot of regulation that you need to abide by. You need to be building out a sales force, right? That's going to go and educate the physicians and the patients, do marketing for the patients on the drug. You have to make sure that you're manufacturing this at scale and you're packaging it at scale. So it's also an extremely expensive process that you need to build out pretty big infrastructure for, and that's why big pharma tends to sort of be the ones to do the commercialization.
So the competitive landscape is pretty much centralized. You have large pharma companies who are really good at scale, and then they typically basically buy out all the promising startups in the space. It's really hard to become a large pharma essentially from the get-go. Is that the case in the space, or?
Yeah.
So the incumbents, the moat around their business model is much deeper than, let's say, in a different space, or that's not the case in biotech.
No, I think you're right that's the case. It's a matter of time and capital that you can raise. I think the most notable recent big pharma example is Moderna, who was able to sort of, from being a really young company to become, I don't know if it's considered a large pharma at this point, but, a medium to large size pharma.
Yeah, sponsoring US Open.
Something's going well.
Yeah. Wonderful. So there are a few more areas of investments in your firm. One of them is digital therapeutics. What's that?
So digital therapeutics are other digital modalities that can help with the treatment of mental health, right? So some areas that we're excited about is VR and AR to potentially help people get prepared for the psychedelic experiences. For example, there's a company called TRIP, TRIPP, that's based here in Los Angeles. And they've developed various programs and experiences in VR that mimic the psychedelic experience.
How does it help to prepare you for?
Yeah, so it's really two ways. The first one is you go into this immersive VR experience, which is psychedelic, and then it can reduce the anxiety that people have for what will happen when they're actually doing psychedelics.
It's pretty cool. So I just put on the Oculus headset and...
Exactly. And you go through the experience, right? And so people kind of...
And I can turn it off whenever I want.
And you can turn it off whenever you want.
Nice.
And so people do that to get prepared for that experience, and that tends to lower their anxiety for when the actual kind of drug-induced experience happens. Mm-hmm. The other thing is it's on its own, without preparing or without taking the drug, has shown to have effectiveness in reducing people's anxiety and just generally improving their well-being.
Mm-hmm. Holistic medicine.
Holistic medicine, yeah. That's not an area that we have made any investments in. I think there's a lot of very interesting modalities that work for people. And that could be something like EMDR or yoga, different types of meditation, different types of psychotherapy modalities, breath work, different types of movement, body work. The issue, however, is that as a venture fund, we need to stay focused on items that we believe will yield venture returns. Mm-hmm. And so while we find really kind of interesting modalities that work, we don't know if they will work at scale, because a lot of times people need to be really invested in it and kind of do the hard work, such as stop drinking, sleep more, exercise more, meditate, right? Those are the hardest things for people to do to really have an effect. And that tends to sort of limit into what we can invest in.
Metabolic psychiatry.
Metabolic psychiatry is kind of a connection between the gut and the brain. There is a lot of preliminary research around how the gut is actually responsible for various symptoms and maybe even causes of mental health issues. Again, these are sort of more early in terms of science, but we believe that this type of modality actually is going to be one of the forefront ones in a decade.
Digital health. Remote access to mental health professionals. I guess Ginger.io will be in the space.
Yeah.
Right. What's your vision for companies in digital health when it comes to psychedelic therapy and mental health?
Yeah, I think the most interesting use of that when it relates to psychedelics is integration and preparation. So again, kind of going back to the things that people can do that will work, but it's hard to do so people don't do it, is doing integration work. So when patients go through a big experience with a psychedelic, it's recommended and sometimes mandated that you do therapy after. It's called integration therapy. So you're basically taking everything that happened during that experience, you talk through it with your therapist, or you kind of work on it yourself so you can get most benefit out of that into yourself, right? Again, it's hard to do. Many people don't do it, and so they don't get as much of the benefit as they could have. How can we, as an industry, allow and help people to do it better, easier, is through connecting them with support groups, with therapists or kind of guides, if they're not licensed therapists, through digital means.
Mm-hmm. How is AI affecting your space? Is it helpful for early detection, maybe some data analysis, machine learning?
There's definitely some use of it. It's not at a large scale, but there are a few companies in our portfolio that are using AI for various purposes. I think, as I mentioned, in kind of the precision psychiatry space, we have a portfolio company that is using AI to analyze data for better predictive diagnostics, better predictive treatment. So what kind of treatments do we recommend this patient to do? And then also for better drug development. We also have portfolio companies that are using AI and ML to generate new molecules to kind of enhance their pipeline of new drugs.
When it comes to generative AI, do you foresee a future when we are going to talk to ChatGPT equivalent, I don't know, Poe or Inflection or any of those kind of any of those chatbots, and then they will be as good and even better than therapists, human therapists?
I mean, I think there's a future when that will happen. But what is good, right? And I think this is such a complex and highly individual thing, just depending on what the person needs at that moment. There are companies that are doing this successfully and at scale. One company that comes to mind is called Woebot. They've been around for a while, and they have a pretty effective CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy bot, right? That helps you basically understand why you're feeling a certain way and then kind of break up the pattern of that thinking so you can get out of that loop. And CBT, as we know, is a very effective therapy modality. I think while there will be more of those and they will be effective, there's never going to be a replacement for human connection. And if anything, kind of if we zoom out of just mental health and how does AI change our world, right? If we believe that many or some of the jobs will be replaced by AI, and so all of a sudden humans have more time to do other things, my hope would be that a lot of these humans would go and retrain in care, right? Whether it's therapy or it's senior people care, it's child care, or it's just human connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think where we've gone in the last few decades with the increase of technology is disconnection, right? People are in their phones, people are really busy because they're doing so many things, all these things are pinging at them. I think people are spending less and less time with their loved ones, less and less time with themselves. And so if AI is benevolent and it can create the space for us while keeping our kind of quality of life the same, we can sort of redirect that towards more of these human connection occupations, or just giving us time to do that without it being an occupation.
So it's sort of a Kai-Fu Lee vision where the AI is doing the diagnostics, but the actual care is done by doctors, human doctors.
Yes, and also I think that there's maybe just making the human care as in like the administration of drugs and things like that. But I'm also talking about therapy, right? Like when it's talk therapy or connection therapy, where you're seeing another human on the other side. A wobot or another bot can, help you maybe get out of your pattern, but really where you feel connection is maybe, and that's kind of the medicine that you need, I think can only be done by a human.
So you've been investing in companies in the space. When do you decide to jump back into the founder's seat and go through that decision-making process? What made you make this jump?
Sure. I've thought about it a lot. And, I think I shared with you for a year and a half, I did 2 jobs, which wasn't good for my mental health. But ultimately, it was really 2 things. The first thing is that I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an operator. That what gives me the most energy. And I think this might be a little bit of an unpopular opinion, but I think most people have a window in life when they can be operators. It's hard to be an operator later in life. And so I kind of saw this as an opportunity, and it's something that I genuinely enjoy. And so I really enjoyed venture. I think there's parts of it, especially the human connection and understanding the larger ecosystem and being able to like build these kind of connections between things that are not yet connected is amazing. But ultimately, I'm an operator and I'm an entrepreneur. The second thing, which really was what tipped over to my decision, is when I learned the results of the human data for what is now our lead program at Freedom Bio. So as an investor, I've been looking in the psychedelic space 4 or 5 years at that point. And I've basically seen most drug development companies and what is the data, what can they do. And when I saw the data from the Yale study, it was a patient data in 20 participants. I knew that we had something really, really, really special.
How big was the
there.
sample?
20 patients.
20 patients.
Yeah, so that's like kind of phase 1, small size.
Mm-hmm.
We saw that our drug extends the efficacy, the antidepressant efficacy, 3 to 4 times than what ketamine does, right? Ketamine, as we talked about, is the fastest acting antidepressant. If people have suicidality episodes, they go to the ER in the US, they most likely give them ketamine because it works almost instantaneously. It's also one of the most effective antidepressants. It has a response rate of 50 to 70%. In hard to treat depressed patients, you compare that to like 20 to 30 with other drugs. So it's a very incredible drug. It has a shortcoming. It only last for like 2 to 7 days. So people have to keep going forward, right? So you have this great drug with this one drawback. And our combo is what's potentially going to address that. So we potentially could have the most effective and fastest acting antidepressant on the market.
So it's fast, is as fast as ketamine, but the effect is
longer,
lasting
right?
for months.
Yeah, so like rather than coming every twice a week or 3 times a week with ketamine, you would come every 2 to 3 weeks, right? Like that's a much different treatment and lifestyle that a patient needs to have. It's way cheaper for the healthcare system. It's way cheaper for the patients, way cheaper for the insurance company, right? It's kind of, if it works, it's a no-brainer. And so when I learned about this, I really had this feeling. I was like, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I don't think people get that too often.
How did you find about this research? Were you reading things on archive.org? How did you come across this study?
I met my co-founder. I was at PsyMed, and we were doing due diligence on a different company that we also wanted to incubate, actually. So what I kept doing as a venture capitalist, I was like, yeah, we can invest, but also we can incubate because I'm an entrepreneur. And so we were thinking about incubating a very different company. It was more of a platform play. And we went to him because he's the ketamine guy. And we asked him a few questions. And then I asked him what he's been working on when he told me about this. And the data just recently came out.
That's the research his team did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how long did it take him to get to that phase 1?
I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to that question, but maybe kind of giving you a larger timeline. They ran the study like in 97, right? Or 98. Mm-hmm. On ketamine as an antidepressant. 2000, the paper was published. It wasn't until 2020 that the paper published on ketamine rapamycin. So it was a 20-year gap between when they showed that ketamine was an antidepressant. And my co-founder, he's a chair of psychiatry. So he teaches people. He's a scientist. He's constantly coming up with new drugs. But he's also a physician, right? He is a psychiatrist who prescribes and treats patients. And so you don't find that kind of combination too often, right? And it's the fact that he was constantly treating really hard to treat patients that he knew that ketamine is great. Works for these people who can't find solutions anywhere else. Ketamine works, but they're struggling because they have to keep coming back, right? And it's hard on their lifestyle. And so he's been basically for 20 years looking for a solution to that. And this is his life's work. And, we're really excited.
So you decide to start a company in 2021. Are you working on multiple drugs at the moment?
We have multiple programs, yes.
And tell us more about the company. Maybe you can, actually, before we talk about the company, what does it take for your drug to get the FDA approval? What's the, how big the sample, like let's say phase 1 is 20 people, phase 2 is 1,000 people or 100 people, like what's the typical number, and what's the requirement from the FDA for the drug to be approved?
Yeah, just I think it all depends on sort of how things go, but generally like phase 2, which we're going into next year, is in the hundreds, could be 100 to 300 patients. Phase 3 start getting into the thousands of patients.
Got it.
With MDMA, it was much smaller group because it was hard to find patients that would qualify. I think it was only around 350. So FDA kind of has some leeway into what you can do. And usually before you run a trial, you go and you talk to the FDA and they kind of say like, we'll accept this and not that. In terms of timeline, we would expect approval in 2030. So we have another like 6 years to get there. And, I think we talked about kind of requirements in terms of money. It's probably around 400 million.
So if let's say your sample is 1,000 people and it's showing, what's the required efficacy rate for it to be FDA approved? Is there a certain number? I
think it's hard to say a certain number. What we were looking for and what the FDA, I think, will find compelling is statistical significance usually. Mm-hmm. So you run trials against a placebo. So like a patient gets a drug, they don't know if it's nothing, it's a sugar pill, or if it's the real medication. And then we're also running trials comparing it to ketamine, because that's ultimately what we're trying to improve upon. And if the results have a statistical significant difference, I mean, we're like materially better, then that sort of gives you the efficacy signal.
How long does the trial typically last? Is it in months and years?
Yeah, I think usually it's, minimum a year.
Mm-hmm.
Could extend to 3 years and even beyond.
And when you pick patients, do you do it in a single town, in a single state? What's the typical when you build out this trial? How do you think about the kind of people you're working with?
Yeah, so the goal here is really to get as good of a representation as you would with your target patient population going forward, right? So you want to make sure that, it's well represented gender-wise. It's well represented in terms of ethnic representation and across the country. So, for example, our next trial will have something like 15 sites. And one of the mandates to the sites is that they have to be keeping to this demographic requirements that we have. Then there's obviously, which you and I talked about, contraindications. They can be contraindicated in a certain way. They have to be above the age of 18. Mm-hmm. And they have to have failed multiple antidepressants, because we're looking for the hard-to-treat depressed patients.
What's your vision for Freedom Biosciences? Where do you want the company to be in 10 years or so?
I have a lot of ambition. I think the most important thing is in 10 years, I really want us to have a drug that's changing many people's lives, right? That's the important thing to us. I think, as I said, this has real potential to be the fastest and acting and one of the most effective antidepressants. Mm-hmm. And we hold a lot of responsibility in bringing this drug to the market and helping millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. So, in terms of where the company is, we could be a standalone company that's doing commercialization. I'm prepared to do that. Or we could be partnering with a larger pharma company who's helping us do that at scale as well.
What are the biggest misconceptions people have about the space of psychedelic therapy?
Microdosing.
Microdosing?
Yeah. I think, most of the media has been focused around microdosing. And I think a lot of people, especially in Venice, California, I used to live in Venice, California. I really like it. I think it's a wonderful place.
Symbolic that we're here.
Yeah, it's a great place. But microdosing is probably what's most kind of present in the media. And microdosing is basically taking a microdose, usually of psilocybin or LSD. And it's a very small dose, and there have been multiple studies that have tried to show that there's some sort of clinical efficacy to help treat depression or anxiety or things like that. And all of those studies have come back negative. I strongly believe the placebo effect is very effective, and that's great. People don't have to take drugs or, other more kind of intrusive treatments to be able to get a positive effect. But ultimately, there's no clinical evidence that microdosing works. And so whenever we say we work in psychedelics, people are like, do you do microdosing? So that's one of the kind of biggest misconceptions, that microdosing is how people treat with psychedelics, and that it is indeed therapeutically effective. I know it's anecdotally effective, and I've met many people whose lives were positively changed, and that's great. It's just not therapeutically, clinically been proven to work. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe other misconceptions is that, it's only for the really hard to treat depressed patients, right? That is the case, and that's where most of the research is happening right now because those people are in most need of a solution. But, there's a lot of evidence, anecdotal evidence primarily, that these are also tools for people's personal self-discovery and spiritual advancement. And I think there's no FDA approval process for that. And I don't think we are going to get to an FDA approval for spirituality. But, psychedelics have been very effective for those pursuits as well. And, they've worked for people.
Time magazine recently published the list of 100 most influential people in AI. If you were to build a similar list for your space, what people would be in that list? Let's say top 10 in the psychedelic space, maybe scientists, entrepreneurs, investors, people who popularize the space and make it, popularize it, they make it more accessible to the masses.
That's awesome. Actually, my friend Nina Bajekal was the one who did it. She's an editor at Time.
That list is so influential. I mean, I see it everywhere.
No, she's great. There are similar lists, not with Time magazine yet, but I would say that they're phenomenal people who have done so much, right? And I would there's different ways to stratify them. There's sort of the scientists, the clinicians, there's the therapists and guys, there's the investors, and there's the entrepreneurs and, other people who are involved. Then there's another way to classify it as people who are the OGs, right? People who've been there since the 70s, 80s, 90s.
And John Krystal would be one of them.
John Krystal would be, I'll tell you a story about John Krystal. And then there's kind of the OGs, and then there's people who've been involved more recently, like myself. I have had a very minimal contribution to the space as compared to some of these other people. So John Krystal got to Yale in 1980 when he went there for his medical degree to become a psychiatrist, and he's basically been at Yale since 1980. It's now 43 years. And he's rise through the ranks to become the chair of psychiatry, which is as high as you can possibly go. And in the 90s, he really put his position at Yale on the line when he asked for this ketamine study to be run, right? We're still, the 90s is very close to the 70s and the early 80s when there was when these drugs were criminalized, right? You wouldn't speak of them, in these institutions. But he had so much conviction there was something there that he was willing to go to these very conservative institutions such as Yale University and pitch this idea, right? And he told me, he's like, I didn't know. I was like, it was a very low likelihood that they would allow for us to run this study. That there was also a likelihood that they would be like, you don't belong here, right? And so with people like that, on whose shoulders we're standing, right? And, hopefully we can be that for the next generation of people who can continue bringing this industry forward.
I mean, John Krystal, maybe a few more names so that our audience can follow them on Twitter to learn more about the space, obviously.
Yeah, I'm not sure John Krystal's on Twitter.
Tim Ferriss, is probably
yes, of course,
big on psychedelics. Funding some research in his own right.
Yeah, so I would say that, from kind of more of these public figures, Tim Ferriss for sure. And, if people are interested in really learning about ketamine, it's the longest ever episode that Tim Ferriss has done. It was 4 hours long with John Krystal. It came out last August. Andrew Huberman just a few weeks ago dropped an episode on ketamine. And he alludes to the work that John Krystal and Rob Berman from Freedom Bio have done. I know Joe Rogan is a big proponent and talks a lot about psychedelics as well. So from the podcasters, I think we've gotten a lot of kind of positive coverage, but also honest coverage about what are the pros and cons of doing this. I think from the scientific world, there are people such as Robin Cardart Harris. He's actually on the scientific advisory board at Freedom Bio. He was at the Imperial College of London. Now he's at UCSF in San Francisco. And he was part of the very first few psilocybin-assisted therapy trials. Roland Griffith, who is the director of the Psychedelic Research Center at Johns Hopkins, who ran the first ever psilocybin study. I mean, he's an eminence, and he's kind of the real OG in the space. There are really a lot of people that I'm missing from this list
good.
now.
The personal chapter. Let's just go through some previous chapters of your life before you did PsyMed, before you did Freedom Biosciences, and maybe some fond memories and lessons learned along the way. So you went to Phillips Academy from 2002 to 2006. What was it like to go to high school like that? Maybe are you still friends with some of your classmates? What are some of the fond memories, maybe your favorite classes from that school?
I mean, that was an incredible chapter of my life because it changed my life forever, right? You and I think, are from the same city.
Well, I moved there later. I was not born there. But you're from Almaty, unlike myself.
Yeah, so like born and raised there. And when I went to Phillips Academy,
how old were you?
At the age of 14. So I went 9th through 12th grade at the age of 14, it was a huge culture shock, like language barrier, we studied English as a second language in school, but like going to school and being a teenager next to all the other Americans was tough. But, you're very adaptable at that age. So, it took a little while. It was a little difficult, but then, you adapt. And it was incredible, right? It was an incredible group of people. I never ever thought that other 14-year-olds could be as ambitious and as intense about what they wanted from life as that, right? As a 14-year-old, you're sort of like, la, la, whatever, like, interests revolved around movies, maybe dating, whatever, right? And then I come to, Phillips, and there are people who are like, I'm going to go to Harvard and I'm going to be a lawyer and I'm going to be the president of the United States. And you're like, I don't know what I'm going to eat for lunch, And so being in that environment has really increased my anxiety, obviously, because it's a lot of pressure to be in, but it definitely kind of expanded what I thought was possible for me. And for that, I'm forever grateful. I'm going to be in Boston, as I told you, next week. And I have already, kind of gotten in touch with some of my old house counselors and teachers, and I'm going to be seeing them. And I'm going to be taking my partner for him to sort of see where I grew up, of sorts. I think my favorite story, it's a little funny. So, we eat horse meat in Kazakhstan, and I didn't think it was like a weird thing. So these 3 girls that I ended up becoming really good friends with, it was first semester, and I was really trying to just make friends. And they were standing there and chatting, and they were talking about how much they love horses, as in riding, because, a lot of people at Andover are very posh, right? They own horses, they ride, they play polo. And they're talking about how much they love horses. And I was like, oh, this is my opportunity to like have a conversation and like.
We have something in common.
We have something in common. I was like, they're so delicious, love horses. And they were shocked. I think they knew that I was very foreign at the time and that, we eventually became friends. But that was sort of one of the funny, culturally, interesting moments that I had at Andover. But that really propelled my life in an incredible direction. I ended up staying in the States for university.
Before we moved to your college life, do you remember the Facebook from your class, of a graduating class? Like, did you have to answer the same question? Like, what's your dream? What do you want to be in 30 years? Do you remember if you had a question like that? Do you remember?
Yeah, I'm sure we did. I think back then I wanted to be an architect. Mm-hmm. And it's interestingly, I'm going to go, that's going to take me into college a little bit, but I took an architecture class, and I don't know what
in high
school ever offers architecture classes, but we did have an architecture class, and that's probably my favorite class that I took. I had a phenomenal architecture teacher, and I was like, I always liked drawing. I didn't like this class that we have in Kazakhstan, Chechnya. I was really bad at it, but I was like, whatever, I'll figure it out. But I wanted to be an architect, and then I ended up going to Cornell University to do civil engineering and architecture, which would have taken me 8 years to complete. I didn't end up doing that. But that was kind of the trajectory.
So you studied city and regional planning at Cornell? Some of your favorite classes from that time, maybe some recommendations you have for city planning and maybe city officials.
Yeah. I have no recommendations. I have no idea what I'm talking about here because I never worked in the space, right? I think, I got to Cornell and I started in civil engineering, and I really wanted to do kind of the planning aspect of it. Civil engineering was too kind of technical and focused on buildings, and what I really want to do was systems. I think this is like where my entrepreneurial side was coming out. I wanted to do systems. I didn't want to build buildings. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up switching to city planning and economics in my second year. And it was a great degree because it has helped me start thinking systematically. And how do you put like very different things? Like how do you think about like how you're building your highways, and how do you connect that to your sewage system, and which direction are your streets facing, right? Like all of this was really interesting to me. But when I graduated, I knew that I didn't want to pigeonhole myself into just city planning. Like ultimately, my first job, my first two jobs out of college were investment banking and management consulting. And that's when I knew that I wanted to remain a generalist. I knew that I wanted to be a manager. I wanted to build things. I had no idea what industry I wanted to be in. And ultimately, at McKinsey, they told us it's better, for my personality. They're like, I think you should be a generalist. You'll be a general manager. And you can then kind of figure out what industry or what company you lead, right? And that's what happened. I worked in oil and gas. I worked in the beauty industry, and then now I'm running a biotech company. Like, mm-hmm. It's crazy, right? Just sort of the variety of things that you're able to do. But once you have these sort of generalist management skills, it's easier to adapt versus kind of trying to really focus on one industry that early on. Mm-hmm. So some people might find this helpful if that's their personality and if that's their interest, trying to stay generalist, and then be able to sort of adapt to to whatever they find interesting.
And now the institution you attended was Oxford. What did you study there?
So Oxford was a study abroad, sort of in American universities, they give you an opportunity to go and study in another country. I studied politics, philosophy, and economics. I didn't really study that much that year. It was kind of a fun year. It was a pass-fail. Got it.
So it was an exchange program between Cornell and Oxford. Mm-hmm. So 3 years at Cornell, 1 year in UK. HBS, 2013 to 2015. What did you learn there? What were some of your favorite classes from HBS?
Yeah. I went to HBS very young. I was only 25, good and bad.
Sometimes, how old were your classmates?
Usually 27, 28. It doesn't seem like a big difference, but, you are a different person at 25 than you are at 27. I had come from about 3.5 years of just really intense work. I was an investment banker working like 80, 90 hours a week. And then I was a management consulting, like traveling nonstop. So I was ready for that break. And it was one of those pivotal, most incredible few years of my life. I've made the bestest friends that I could. And I think, it's, you read 500 cases, putting yourselves in the shoes of a CEO or a general manager, founder, whatever, and you're constantly kind of living their lives, and you're starting to get used to the idea that this could be you one day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's really allowed me to believe that I don't need another job, and then found a company. I went directly into it, right? Pros and cons, again, of having done that or gone to a bigger company to get more experience, but it is what it is, and I'm happy with my choice. My favorite things about HBS, or favorite classes you asked. Obviously, incredible institutions. You want to learn finance, you want to learn ops, you want to learn marketing, whatever. I'm a big believer in soft skills. I think at a certain point, probably in your late 20s, you're like, I know how to get the skills that I want, or I know how to go and talk to people to get those skills. So hard skills, important, but secondary. I think if you want to be a manager, if you want to be a founder, if you want to lead people, it's really about the soft skills. And it starts with you, right? What is it inside you that motivates you? And what is it inside you that scares you? Because our fear is what prevents us from really going after the things that I want. Every time I didn't achieve something that I wanted, I knew, yes, luck, but really what's in my control is to work through my fears, right? And so the favorite class, it's called Authentic Leadership Development, ALD. It's something that's given in it's an elective in the second year. And basically, you go to class, but that's not important. You have these groups, they're called T groups, right? It's 6 or 8 people that you meet with for 3-4 hours every Wednesday. And you are going pretty deep and very vulnerable. How you grew up, what are you most ashamed
It's a group
of?
therapy session in a way.
It's a group therapy session, right? And it's with your classmates. It's hard to do when you're in your 20s and you want to be all cool. And
you don't want to be judged, yeah.
You don't want to be judged. So I think it was on a surface level, but it gave me a taste of what I was discovering about myself that was then helping me kind of overcome certain belief systems that I had that then helped me break through them and be like, oh, I can actually do better or do differently. And so another pivotal thing I think after ALD is I chose to move to San Francisco and not New York City.
Before we discuss that, what case study from the ones you read at HBS is most memorable, most impactful, and you still remember it to this day?
Yeah.
If any.
I mean, there's one that's really painful. I think it was really painful for the founders, and the founder came to class, and we kind of could see how it affected her. It was a case about Zipcar. Successful business. We see Zipcars all over the world. There was a mistake that was made in the beginning where the 2 founders just split the company in half, 50-50. Right? No vesting, just 50-50. And one of the founders ended up just having some personal, circumstances. I think she was a young mom or, something else happened. I'm sure it was kind of serious enough for her to say, I can't work on this. I don't want to do it. Mm-hmm. So everything fell on the other person. And she built this company to what it was, but there was a big mismatch in kind of the ownership.
And then they never revised it.
They never revised it, right? From what I read in the case. And what's more is that she often had to go back to the other person and say, I need your approval because we're 50-50, right? There's no kind of critical decision maker. And then I think later on, I ended up reading Noam Wasserman's book. He's a professor at HBS that talks about founders' dilemmas, right? And this is the relationships between founders. And I think one of the best things that I learned at HBS is what not to do with founder relationships. So since then, I've had very successful relationships with all my partners and co-founders. Because in the beginning, we have the difficult conversations. Who's the ultimate decision maker? What do you need to do to be able to vest equity? Mm-hmm. Something happens, right? How do we revise this? And how does everyone on the team feel like what they're contributing is being properly compensated? And if they're not, what's a way to revise that?
What if you were to share your playbook with future founders, what are some of your recommendations? Let's say, what's a fair equity split? What's a fair vesting period?
I mean, it all depends. Absolutely depends. I can't really say about equity splits here. But I think a few things that I really believe is that there needs to be a decision maker. So if there's two founders and they're equally kind of committed to it, someone needs to have the 51%.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's an impasse, one needs to make the decision. And we've implemented that across the board. And I always look at the cap table. And if there's something sketchy like that, we make them change it.
It slows down the decision making.
Yeah. And if there's a difficult conversation, the other founder can block some decision makers. You know, they say this, and I think it was the original YC founder who said, like, most companies don't die because of external competition, they implode.
Yeah.
And so, like, whatever you can do,
it's suicide as opposed to...
It's suicide, yeah. So whatever you can do internally to prevent that, it's important to do that. And I think vesting is really important. People need to be vesting. I think 4-year vest, 1-year cliff is as widely used as it is for a reason. I think it works. I think, yeah, those are some important things.
Once you graduated, you decide to move to San Francisco. You start a company in the beauty space. What are some of your lessons learned from that industry? How, and maybe some advice for founders who are thinking of starting a company in the beauty space?
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe not so much beauty space as it's more, I think, as you can probably tell, I'm not going to be like the most tactical advice giver, because I think tactically, like, there's so much out there.
Yeah.
It all depends. And, you know, it's a lot of like personal decisions, so industry specific. And the beauty industry today is very different than it was 10 years ago, right? When I was starting my company. I think it's about your nimbleness and how you are as a founder, because I think the personal struggles and the personal characteristics are kind of the same. I think my lessons learned from that company is to actually listen to your customer without having your ego and your vision get so in the way of things. You can have a vision, it just needs to be nimble enough to change with what the market and what the customer is saying to you. And I think I was very young and I wanted it to work so much that I was missing a lot of what the market was saying to me. And that ended up just, you know, not a big deal. It was a couple of years of kind of working in a direction that wasn't right. So I think just having that humility and that open-mindedness and just needing to check your ego to be able to really like build a product that people need.
Before you started Freedom Biosciences, you got a master's degree at CIIS. Why did you decide to why did you decide to pursue this degree? And again, what did you learn in Cal Institute of Integral Studies?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it was for two reasons. One was a personal interest. And I'm actually continuing to do my PhD there part-time. And the PhD is focused on what are some therapy modalities, right? There's different types of therapies that people do that can support psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, right? So one thing is giving people a drug and them going through the experience, but how can you support them during, before, or after the trip to really integrate it in a very effective way? And so during my master's degree at CIS, I was learning about not all, but some portion of these therapy modalities, from Gottman to Gestalt to kind of more mystical, more shamanic types of modalities to try and understand what is the larger ecosystem of therapies, to then be able to say, okay, this could potentially be integrated into psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And I think for me, outside of the personal interest, it's really important for me to stay in touch with what's happening in the relationship between the therapist and the patient. Because a lot of the treatment, a lot of the therapeutic effect is in that relationship. Like, if people can learn to trust their therapist, they're through that healing a lot of their mistrust towards the world, towards themselves, their partner, their boss, their parents, right? Whatever the challenging relationship in their life is. And that's a really important relationship. But as a venture capitalist and as a CEO of a biotech company, I had no way of interacting on a regular basis with this part of our kind of patient journey. And so I think one of the biggest things that I continuously see as failure points for CEOs, failure points for venture capitalists, for government, high-end government officials, is that they lose touch with what the people want, like who's the end kind of benefactor. And so that was my way of kind of systematically being able to engage and potentially contribute to it.
Mm-hmm. Top 3, your favorite movies. Let's start from that. Softball, if you watch any.
I do watch movies. I don't.
Movies, TV shows.
Oh, TV shows. Okay, we can get to TV shows. I like things that are lighthearted. I think life is serious, so I like things that are lighthearted. I've probably rewatched Friends 20 times. How I Met Your Mother is another favorite of mine. And Billions is probably another one. I won't like rewatch it, but I enjoy it.
Did you watch season 2 and 3 of Billions?
Yeah.
What do you think of it? Is it as good as season 1? Or
no, season 1's
so good.
So good. Yeah.
Your favorite podcasts?
My favorite podcasts, yeah. So what I listen to. So I think you and I talked about the All In podcast. I think it's just something that I really like, because it's I don't like reading the news. I try to like delete as much of like information in my life. So that's kind of my like an hour a week, and I get the information that I hopefully would have gotten if I still lived in Silicon Valley. So I find a huge amount of utility in that. I listen.
Who's your favorite bestie?
Okay, let's skip this one. In terms of, I listen to the New York Times Daily for my like larger geopolitical business news. And my third most, this is the one that I actually enjoy. It's called The Art of Accomplishment. It's by Joe Hudson, who is a former venture capitalist in Silicon Valley turned executive coach. And he just talks about the really kind of like the personal challenges that a lot of the CEO, because he coaches some really high-end CEOs in Silicon Valley, and he never names names, but he talks about, topics that people don't talk about, like shame and feeling humiliated and feeling fear, and like how do these people who are seemingly, indestructible are feeling these feelings, and how they're overcoming that, and what effect does that have on their organizations, which are like tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. So it's something that I find really helpful for myself as well.
3 favorite quotes or principles or things you believe in.
I think it's sit with your fear, sit with whatever you're uncomfortable with. I really believe in the power of giving attention to the things that we don't want to give attention to, because that way we actually find freedom from them. Do things that you don't want to do. I think it's kind of a similar one here. But I see a lot of really smart people who have the right intentions, but then they don't do things that they don't want to do, and then they don't get the results that they want. And I think that's that's just, I think that's what kind of separates the successful founders from not such successful founders. And just also play. Like, I think we tend to be very like serious and all that. So when I watch movies, I don't watch documentaries. It's too serious for me. I don't read the news. It's too serious for me. I like to go out. I like to play with my dog. I love going to the beach. I watch stand-up comedy.
3 people who influenced your life in the most profound way.
I think the 2 of my parents in their own respects. My mom is incredibly kind and present, you know, like having a parent that's just like, you come to them and they're like, yes, here's my full attention, you're the most important thing in the world for me, I think gave me a lot of confidence, and like just the feeling that I am important, which is great. And my mom just like, whatever she did really well. She didn't like go out and do a lot of things, but like, you know, if she was cooking something, she did really well. If she cleaned, she did it really well. If like she worked her entire time, and she was always like the favorite professor at the university. My father is very bold. He kind of just believes that he can do anything. And that also like breaks these like invisible ceilings in my head. That was really, really helpful. And he's not shy to ask for things that he wants, which, you know, I'm still working on. But you know, my parents obviously had a huge impact in those ways. I think a third person would be my co-founder, Dr. John Krystal, because, you know, when I came to him and I was like, I think I want to help you do this thing. I want to bring your life's work to the market. I was a 32-year-old person. I have never had a successful exit. I've never really done anything that was so notable with my life. He's one of the kind of top psychiatrists in the world. He's made these incredible discoveries. And he believed in me. He believed that I could be the person to do it.
What did he see in you think?
I think he saw that I cared and that I was going to really commit to it. You know, I'm sure at the same time there were a lot of competing forces. Psychedelics were getting hot. There were larger pharma companies. There were kind of smaller but psychedelic companies with tens, hundreds of millions, right? We didn't have any money at the time, that they were coming to him and asking him for this technology. But I think he's so accomplished, and he was one of the founders of Biohaven, which I told you was one of the largest kind of acquisitions of all time in pharma. He, I think, just cared that this gets into the market, that patients get access to this. And I think what he saw as a possibility of working with me is that I was going to do whatever it takes to get to that point, versus, you know, maybe gets lost in the shuffle of a big organization, and if they change direction and whatever might happen.
What is your dream outside of your career?
What is my dream outside of my career? So, you know, obviously to have a family and create this nest that's going to, you know, be a source of joy and safety in my life. But, you know, maybe something that's going to be kind of different from most people that you're speaking to is... I would really like to help establish more mental health support and domestic violence victim support in Kazakhstan. So currently, you know, there just isn't enough time and capital that I have. But I think as I'm able to dedicate more of my resources, that is something that I'd really like to do.
What's your big career dream?
I don't know what is going to take shape, and like whether I'm CEO or whether I'm part of a bigger team in a large pharma company, maybe I'm in venture or whatever it is I'm doing. I think I just really want to see something that I've worked on to be helping people that really need it, right? So my hope would be that with Freedom Biosciences will be one of our drugs that's in the market and it's really helping people.
And the final piece is your question to our audience.
Yeah, the question for the audience, I would love to see how people have been able to help themselves as they're going through various challenging episodes with depression or anxiety, or just challenging episodes in their lives. Is it meditation? Is it animals? Is it writing? Is it listening to music, right? I think we all have our wellness stack of sorts. And I think I'm always like looking to add to my own. I get asked this question a lot. So I think it would just be great to know what has been helping you.
This was N Factorial Podcast with incredible Dina Burkitbayeva. Be so good, we cannot ignore you.